Hi everybody, in this video I am going to be reading something with you for the first time. I haven't read it yet. I'm going to be reading it and hopefully we both find it interesting. It is Seth Benardete, a scholar of classical learning of Plato, Homer, Herodotus, and others. He has this essay called Strauss, that's Leo Strauss, the scholar of the history of political philosophy, a beloved teacher, a great man, the inspiration for all of my work, Leo Strauss. Strauss on Plato. So here we go. Seth Benardete, Strauss on Plato. I've been meaning to read this. Somebody sent it to me, and I figured we'd just read it together. What philosophy is seems to be inseparable from the question of how to read Plato. Now, almost no philosopher after Plato wrote at length about philosophy. And from antiquity, at least, there are few notices that inform us about the principles of Platonic writing. Three, however, stand out. The first two, in Plutarch and Cicero, respectively, point directly to the issue of esotericism. Let me just pause for a minute. So those of you who are watching this who don't know, esotericism is the idea that authors have one message that they put on the surface of their books that's easily accessible to even the common reader, and another teaching that's a little bit less accessible, that's not meant for just every reader, and that exists, as it were, between the lines of the surface text. So again, esotericism is the view that there's a hidden message in the text for a specific kind of reader. So let's go back here. Three writings that stand out. The first two in Plutarch and Cicero, respectively, point directly to the issue of esotericism. The third in Aelian to the very nature of philosophy. Plutarch implies that by the subordination of natural necessities to more divine principles, Plato made philosophy safe for the city. And in the Tusculan Disputations, Cicero remarks that he followed the way of Socrates as it was made known by Plato in his own dialogues in concealing his own opinions, relieving others of error, and seeking in every dispute what is most like to the truth. Let me just say something here for you about this right here. Plutarch implies that by the subordination of natural necessities to more divine principles, Plato made philosophy safe for the city. Whenever you see a Straussian or a classical scholar write about the city, it's very important. Greek term polis, crucial theme. It's the main kind of political community in these texts that you need to be aware of and think about. But it's not like the city of Los Angeles or the city of Montreal, or the city of Toronto. It means it's not the state or the country quite in that sense, but it's like the political community. So why did Plato have to make philosophy safe for the political community? Well, and by the way, I should just clarify too, there are other kinds of political community, but just don't think city of Montreal, city of Toronto, city of Los Angeles. The city is the polis. It's the comprehensive political order. So why did Plato have to make philosophy safe for the city? Well, you may know the story of Socrates, who philosophized and was accused of corrupting the youth, not believing in the gods of the city. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. So philosophy in the case of Socrates was not safe for the city, safe for the political community. And yet, maybe to a certain extent, Plato made it so by presenting the natural necessities that philosophy inquires into as divine principles, or subordinating those natural necessities to divine principles. I guess we could have picked something easier to read together, but I want to read this, so let's do it. Cicero remarks that he followed the way of Socrates as it was made known by Plato in his own dialogues, in concealing his own opinions, relieving others of error, and seeking in every dispute what is most like to the truth. Aelian tells the story of the printer Pawson, who was hired to paint a racehorse rolling in dust and instead painted it running. And when his patron objected, Pawson told him to turn it upside down. And Aelian says that there was much talk to the effect that this resembled the speeches of Socrates. Let's think about that. Hold on a second. He was hired to paint a racehorse rolling in dust, instead painted it running. When his patron objected, he said to turn it upside down, and this resembled the speeches of Socrates. Got to think about why that is. Somehow the speeches of Socrates show you something different depending on how you look at them, and not just arbitrarily different, but different in a deliberate way. It was the extraordinary merit, Let me just make myself smaller here so that we're not cutting off any text. Hold on a moment. That's better. It was the extraordinary merit of Leo Strauss to experience the import of these three remarks among others and render them to the life in his own writings on Plato and elsewhere. This achievement amounts to, in my opinion, as great a recovery as that of Al-Farabi, who rediscovered philosophy in the 10th century. Al-Farabi, medieval Islamic figure. So I want to just say something to you here. Al-Farabi rediscovered Plato in the 10th century. Leo Strauss rediscovered philosophy in the 20th century. That may strike some of you as strange, the idea that philosophy is something that needs to be discovered or rediscovered. Isn't it just kind of discipline like logic, ethics, metaphysics, politics? What's the issue? Why would it need to be rediscovered? Why was it ever lost or obscured in the first place? Well, our hint here, for those of you who are new to this kind of thing, our hint here is that if philosophy is made, quote unquote, safe for the city, if it undergoes a kind of, if it's presented in a certain way where there is a concealment of opinions or where the horse is drawn upside down, so to speak, then what can happen over time is that people no longer recognize that there's something concealed, and they no longer recognize that they can look at the painting from another perspective. And they take the politically safe presentation of philosophy and confuse it for philosophy proper. The common thread in their recovery was no doubt, that means the recovery of Leo Strauss and Al-Farabi, the recovery of philosophy by Leo Strauss and Al-Farabi. The common thread in their recovery was no doubt their common understanding of revelation as the alternative to philosophy. But since after paganism, the three religions were already infected by philosophy to various degrees, right? There's some philosophy in Islam, some philosophy in Judaism. You may know, for example, the importance of Aristotle to Maimonides, some philosophy in Christianity, clearly, and therefore the contrast or the starkness of the alternative that revelation poses to philosophy can get confused. So let's just go back to this. Let's read this from the beginning again. So the common thread in their recovery was no doubt their common understanding of revelation as the alternative to philosophy. But since after paganism, the three revealed religions were already infected by philosophy to various degrees, they had to recover revelation in its true form at the same time as they recovered its opposite. That means that rediscovering philosophy means rediscovering revelation as an alternative to philosophy rather than as something that is compatible with philosophy through and through. For both purposes, Plato's Laws was their guide. So for the purposes of discovering philosophy, rediscovering it, and for the purposes of distinguishing it from revelation clearly, I kind of want to just show you. Plato's Laws was their guide. As a recovery, theirs might seem of less significance than the original discovery. Is the rediscovery of philosophy or the original discovery of philosophy more significant? But as both Al-Farabi and Strauss knew, the original discovery was itself not at the beginning of philosophy. Philosophy had to be rediscovered by Socrates long after there had been philosophy. Plato has Socrates call his rediscovery a second sailing. So the guy that we're reading right now, Seth Benardete, he also has this book, Socrates' Second Sailing on Plato's Republic, referring to a figure of speech in one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates' second sailing. The second sailing is philosophy, and it is never first. The false start of philosophy can alone jumpstart philosophy. Now, this is, if anybody's even listening to this anymore, probably not so easy to understand, but the idea that philosophy is always something to be rediscovered, that philosophy's first beginning is a false step, and only its second step is the proper beginning of philosophy. These are ideas important for Benardete for sure, and he's using them here to help us think about whether or not we should esteem. Because look, Strauss rediscovered philosophy in the 20th century. Al-Farabi rediscovered it in the 10th. Should we be more concerned with the rediscovery, or should that just direct our attention back to the original, to the first discovery? Well, what he's saying here is philosophy is always just the second step. It really only gets started in its rediscovery. Why? Okay, there we go. The caution and the daring that characterized all of Leo Strauss's works. You have to read Leo Strauss. I have a course on him too, in fact, in my school, millermanschool.com. But this is beautifully stated. There's both caution and daring in Leo Strauss's works. The caution and daring that characterized all of Leo Strauss's works are conspicuous in his interpretations of Plato. One could say that for Strauss, the caution came from his beloved Xenophon, and the daring from the divine Plato. But it would be more precise to say that Strauss always refused to separate Xenophon and Plato, and in this showed especially his difference from the interpretation of Plato that had come to prevail since the time of Schleiermacher. Let me say something to you about Xenophon, those of you who don't know the name. Somehow, we take an interest in Plato, and we see that in Plato, there is a character who is somehow particularly prominent, namely Socrates. This is basic enough. For those of you who don't know it, you should know Plato never wrote, Plato doesn't write in his own name, like I'm the author. Plato, these are my thoughts on ethics. Rather, he writes dialogues where there are characters, and one of the main characters, or one of the characters that often leads the discussion. Now, the reason I put it like this, main characters, because we don't want to prejudge the issue. There may be a minor character who is a main character in a particular dialogue, judged in terms of the importance of his contribution. Maybe he just says one thing in passing, and that's the clue to understanding the whole dialogue. But as a first approximation, Socrates is obviously important for Plato. And so we therefore have the question of Socrates on the table. Was there anybody else who knew him? Was there anybody else who wrote about him? And the answer is that yes. Two people in particular are of crucial importance for helping us to understand Socrates. They are Aristophanes, an old comic poet, who wrote a play in which Socrates has a think tank, and I don't want to spoil it for you. So the play is called The Clouds by Aristophanes. This play formed the basis of accusations against Socrates later in his life that are mentioned, according to the accounts, in his trial before the jury of Athens. So you have Aristophanes, and Strauss has a book on Aristophanes and all of his plays. But you also have Xenophon. Xenophon, who knew Socrates, who wrote works, dialogues that are Socratic dialogues. And Xenophon was a general. He wrote other things. He wrote about Cyrus and his own military campaigns. But what's important is that if we are really intrigued about Socrates and we really want to know who he was, what his way of life was, why he's so beloved, and what we can learn from him, then we need to triangulate. It's not enough to have Plato. We need Plato, Aristophanes, and Xenophon. So here, what Benardete is telling us, leaving Aristophanes to the side, is that Xenophon and Plato wrote about Socrates or depicted Socrates differently. The suggestion here is that Plato's depiction is the one that gives us the daring, and Xenophon's is the one that gives us the caution. Here's the thing. If you read Xenophon, you might fall asleep from the apparent boredom and simplicity, rustic simplicity of it. Whereas when you read Plato, you can be driven to the heights of divine rapture and erotic madness. Pretty incredible experience. But what you see when you read Xenophon is that he's not just a rustic bore. He is cautious, and you're only cautious when there's something there that could be dangerous. So Plato and Xenophon, okay, for Strauss, a combination of daring and caution. Let's go back to the text. Strauss's caution appears most obviously in the extreme reticence he maintained when it came to the so-called Platonic forms. A typical interpretation that you may have heard, Philosophy 101, somewhere, is that Plato had this theory of forms, theory of ideas, that everything is what it is by virtue of the fact that it participates in some higher metaphysical version of itself. So I have three, let's say I have, let me use a different example. You say, Here's the phone. My phone. Well, there's a Platonic form of the phone. And what is it that makes all phones phones? That they embody or participate in the Platonic form of the phone. Well, Strauss had this quote unquote extreme reticence when it came to the Platonic forms. He does not present them as a metaphysical doctrine or as metaphysical objects. But his daring is thereby all the more striking when one realizes that his thought was always fixed on the beings, whether God, man, or beast, and the whole. Yeah, so on one hand, Strauss's thought is always fixed on the beings, but he's not interpreting the beings in terms of the forms. Strauss was the master of the connection between the small and the large, or of the ways in which the one participates in and hence fails to be identical with the other. Strauss's mastery was such that its inherent difficulty does not strike home until one tries it oneself and comes up with quite arbitrary links that do not in fact encompass all of the particulars and hence fall short of the truly general. Okay, you just have a problem here in reading Strauss and reading Plato of linking up the large and the small, the particular and the general. You can go to the Leo Strauss Center archives and find notes of Leo Strauss's in-class teaching, and you'll often find simple everyday examples that make the point beautifully. There was at least one contemporary of Strauss, Benardete continues, who had an equally uncanny eye for the unnoticed but significant detail. What he noticed was surprisingly different from what Strauss did, but his ability to work up from it to the beginning and down from the beginning to the detail was no match for Strauss's. Strauss came to almost everything experientially. He shunned theories. Extremely important. This lies at the basis of so much that Strauss conveyed to his students and so much that is at the heart of how I've tried to read in and out of my school. Strauss came to almost everything experientially. He shunned theories. It was what he had found out for himself that he most relied on. Let me just tell you quickly. Imagine you have a theory is sort of a construct that gets between you and the book, between you and the argument. It's a filter. It is a construct or a filter that gets between you and what's going on in the book. And it's going to filter some things through well, but it's going to leave some things out. And the things that get left out may be the ones that we need in order to understand what the author's talking about. So Strauss, in my restatement of it here, orients us towards, well, we're trying to remove the filter that stands between us and the text, and sometimes those filters are theories. It was what he found out for himself that he most relied on. His reading of Plato was not different from his own thinking, not in the sense that his opinions were Plato's or Plato's his, but in the element of Platonic dialectics Strauss saw and practiced his own way. I can't imagine anybody's watching this far in such a topic, but it's my pleasure to talk about it, and I want to have a record of it, and somebody may care enough. What we're reading is Seth Benardete, one of Strauss's students and the author of some studies of Plato, as well as Homer, Herodotus, and others. Benardete writing about Strauss on Plato. Leo Strauss, beloved teacher, reincarnation of Socrates, if I can do the overstated version of it. Incredible man, scholar, teacher, and philosopher. We go down here, and this is Benardete telling us that Strauss's thinking just was the same as the practice of Platonic dialectic. Once again, his reading of Plato was not different from his own thinking, not in the sense that his opinions were Plato's or Plato's his, but in the element of Platonic dialectic, Strauss saw and practiced his own way. One has to turn to Xenophon, remember this other author who, among other topics, wrote about Socrates, in order to understand the double sense contained within the Platonic dialogue. Xenophon says that to converse meant for Socrates the coming together of men for the purpose of deliberation by dividing the things by kinds. Again, Xenophon says that to converse meant for Socrates the coming together of men for the purpose of deliberation by dividing the things by kinds. The middle voice, you see here, he's got dialogestai in the converse, contains within it the active dialegein. The communication among men involves the articulation of things. Or a word that I like from a certain history of reading Heidegger, making distinctions, distinguishing, articulating. This Heraclitean insight into the double nature of logos, let me just underscore that for you. What's the double nature of logos? What is the double nature? That we have conversing, dividing. Dialegestai, dialegein. Whoops. Sorry about that. Let's go back here. What's the best way? All right. This double nature was the basis for Strauss's reading of Plato. He put this double nature into the title of one of his last books, The Argument and Action of Plato's Laws. The "and" in the title is misleading. It does not mean that some sort of action is represented while the argument is being developed. Oh, can you see my cursor here? It does not mean that some sort of action is being represented while the argument is being developed. It means that the action has an argument, that the argument is the true argument of the laws. Let me just say it again. There are things in Plato's dialogues that happen, that are not just stated, they're not just said. They are dramatic details. They're the action of the dialogue. Maybe the speakers change. So it was this speaker, now it's this speaker. Or maybe there's something else that's going on, the action of the dialogue. Strauss developed this view that the action is the argument. The action conveys the argument. If you just isolate the logical conceptual argument from the dramatic argument, you're missing the full argument, the actual teaching. So that's why Strauss paid extremely close attention to the action of Plato's dialogues and produced incredible insights thereby. So Strauss put this double nature into the title of one of his last books, The Argument and the Action of Plato's Laws. The "and" in the title is misleading. It does not mean that some sort of action is represented while the argument is being developed. It means that the action has an argument and that argument is the true argument of the laws. That Strauss did not call his book The Argument in the Action underlies the initial separateness of argument and action in a Platonic dialogue and the latent community between them. So what we first see in a Socratic dialogue, or what we first see in a Platonic dialogue, is that on one hand, you have arguments, and on the other hand, you have action. Perfect example at the start of the Republic. Let me just read it to you, and you'll see. We turn to the beginning of the Republic. And listen, tell me, do you hear argument? Do you hear action? What do you hear? Reading from the beginning, book 1. Socrates is the speaker. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday. The Piraeus is the port of Athens. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to pray to the goddess. And at the same time, I wanted to observe how they would put on the festival, since they were now holding it for the first time. Now, in my opinion, the procession of the native inhabitants was fine, so there's a religious festival and the Athenians perform. But the one the Thracians, this other people, conducted was no less fitting a show. After we had prayed and looked on, we went off toward the town. That's the first part of the Republic. Socrates is narrating that he went down to the Piraeus yesterday, that he went with somebody, that they went to pray to a goddess, and that they went to observe a festival. They saw two versions of the festival, one the locals and one the Thracians. They prayed, they looked on, and they went off toward town. That's the beginning, opening line. Is that argument? Is it action? Could you do in a Cole's Notes summary here, well, is there anything going on there in terms of an exchange of, there's no argument there, it would seem. And yet, like I say in my first lecture on Plato's Republic at millermanschool.com, there's a lot going on here that's of crucial importance and that we might miss completely without Strauss's guidance, without Strauss directing us back to the text slowly and cautiously. So, for example, one of the things that Socrates was accused of, let's say, is like religious innovation, introducing new gods into the city. And yet what we learned from this first paragraph, among other things, is that the Athenians themselves had already welcomed other gods into the city because they have some novel, innovative religious festivals there. You see, so there's already a spirit of innovation. The dialogue takes place in the commercial harbor. And there's a spirit of innovation, okay, including potentially religious innovation. And at the same time, you may know from the famous image of the philosopher Kings and of Plato's cave allegory that there's a kind of return into the cave, a going down, firstly being brought up or going up out of the cave. So you're no longer looking at the shadows on the wall, you're looking at the sun. But then the people who undergo this process of philosophical education, in the example, are compelled to go back down into the cave to rule. So there's a return down. And the very first word, the very first line in English, the very first word in Greek is I went down. So when Socrates tells us he went down, is that argument or action? Well, it's an action that bears an argument. Strauss was not the first to notice the dramatic setting of a Platonic dialogue. He was not even the first to suggest that the drama altered the apparent meaning of the argument. But what is peculiarly his discovery was that once argument and action are properly put together, an entirely new argument emerges that could never have been expected from the argument on the written page. Something happens in a Platonic dialogue that in its revolutionary unexpectedness is the equivalent to the periagoge, I guess you pronounce it, as Socrates calls it, of philosophy itself, the turning around. Something happens in a Platonic dialogue that in its revolutionary unexpectedness is equivalent to this turning around of philosophy itself. This turnaround has a peculiar structure. It has to be experienced and can never be formulated in such a way as to allow one anything more than anticipation of an equivalent turnaround in another dialogue. There cannot be a method of thought in the thoughtful going after of thought. I'll explain this to you momentarily. The complete rationality of the ineffable seems to be around the bend and open to the charge of mysticism and obscurantism. But Strauss saw that such a consequence of Platonic dialectic was nothing other than the sobriety of the highest kind of madness, which is philosophy, that Socrates celebrates in the Phaedrus. All right. Can't say everything about this, but I have to say something about it. Something happens in a Platonic dialogue, a kind of conversion experience. And you might think that conversion experience is mystical or religious and not philosophical, that it is irrational or super rational and not rational. And yet there is a, quote, sobriety of the highest kind of madness, which is philosophy. I don't know if you know anything I've done on Alexander Dugin or if that's a familiar name, but there's a helpful way of looking at this, which is that, how can we put it? Apollo, representing a kind of vertical ascent, Mount Olympus, standing in the bright light of the sun, the clear sword of rationality, to use an image from the tarot, the sword cuts through all the clouds, this vertical, luminous, solar, intellectual power. It also has, so first of all, it stands in contrast to Dionysus, this intermediary figure who crosses the threshold between darkness and light, who does not live on the peak of Mount Olympus and basking in the ever glowing sun, but who's this liminal figure who descends into the underworld. Well, there's a kind of Dionysian aspect to Apollo, because like a properly Apollonian Dionysus. And this Dionysian aspect of Apollo is, quote, the sobriety of the highest kind of madness. So at the peak of Apollonian intellectual rationality is a kind of madness which is philosophy. But it's not mystical or obscurantist. And it's distinct in a way from the specific madness that belongs to Dionysus. Okay, never mind that if that wasn't helpful, if it was confusing, or if you have a million more questions about it. Again, the key thing that he's telling us here, Strauss was not the first to have noticed that the drama matters in a dialogue, but he was the first to put together the drama and the argument to see that they give us a new argument, which has the effect of a kind of conversion. There are two kinds of esotericism, ancient and modern. Swift represented one by the bee, which out of the sweet produces the sweet, and the other by the spider, which out of the foulest things produces the most beautiful web. The first kind is metaphysical esotericism, the second, political. The first kind necessarily includes the second. Metaphysical esotericism necessarily includes political esotericism. The second, political esotericism, necessarily denies the first. The first says that it is in the nature of things that things are hidden. So esoteric, you might think, just means like occult, the secret teaching metaphysically about the hidden realities. That's kind of what he means here about the metaphysical esotericism. But political esotericism has something to do with concealing a teaching that is dangerous, that is not about the metaphysical nature of the world, I think. Let's see. The first says that it is in the nature of things that things are hidden. The second says that it is in the nature of the city, as now constituted, that this is so. The second proposes enlightenment, the lightening up of things until nothing and no one are in the dark. The first sets out to disclose things in their hiddenness and show the reality of what appears. I think the way I interpreted that was wrong. The problem inherent in the surface of things, and only in the surface of things, as Strauss put it, is the heart of things. This sentence is merely a rendering of what Al-Farabi says is the way to interpret Plato. Let's go back for a minute. Two kinds of esotericism, ancient and modern. Modern esotericism says that it's in the nature of the city as now constituted that this is so. Okay, modern esotericism, in other words, suggests that it's possible for all the things that are hidden to be revealed if only the city is so constituted as to facilitate enlightenment. It's not that people are in the dark because it belongs to the nature of things that some people can be in the light and some people must remain in the dark. Rather, it's a function of our political order. And if we change our political order, we can have public enlightenment. That's the second modern version of esotericism. The first one, ancient one, says the things that are hidden can be disclosed, but they can't be disclosed to everybody. They can't be disclosed in a way that removes the darkness, lifts the veil, and enlightens the whole. All right, so the way that I was thinking about it was not correct. I always thought it would be helpful to bring in, like Madame Blavatsky and Rosicrucians and the kind of esotericism that's concerned with occult realities. But here the distinction is that's not the distinction. The distinction is either it's a function of the political order that things remain hidden, that's modern, or it belongs to the nature of things themselves, that some of them stay hidden from a certain kind of person. You can try to make sense of it the way that you would like to, and I don't want to claim that I've done a perfect job. The first thing Strauss was always doing in his study of Plato was to be a beginner. Are we beginners when we read these books? Are we always beginning again? Because if we want to learn what Strauss learned, if we want to see what Strauss saw, and in general, if we want to be open to discovering the secrets of these books, we need to, like Strauss did here, according to Benardete, know how to start again. Not as if you were starting for the first time, but really starting for the first time. You finish reading The Republic the first time, well, the second time is going to be the first time proper, because now you're going to be well prepared to do it the way that you ought. It is what Strauss must have had in mind when he wrote to Gadamer that he could not recognize in Gadamer's theory of hermeneutic experience, which as such is a universal theory, his own experience as an interpreter, which made him feel, quote, the irretrievably occasional character of every worthwhile interpretation. This experience calls for a practice of being without habits. Socrates calls it the practice of dying and being dead, and identified it with philosophy. Again, what he's guarding against here is reading the book with a theory in hand, with a habit well established, with something that can get in the way of ourselves and the text. This experience, the practice of dying and being dead, the practice of philosophy, the practice of being without habits or without theory that gets in the way of things. This experience would be impossible were there not a hiddenness to things that metaphysical esotericism recognizes and reproduces through trapdoors and arguments. Socrates' account of the structure of the soul in the Republic is one such example. Only if one follows patiently Socrates' argument about desire can one see it turn upside down and discover that it is the presentation of desire by the thumo-eidetic that has put on the mask of reason. Thumo-eidetic, thumos is our spiritedness, our spirited anger to a certain extent, our righteous reaction to things, potentially, or our, let's say, the fight in us. He has an account in this book right here. As I showed you earlier, Socrates' Second Sailing, where he tries to think carefully about the presentation of desire in Plato's Republic in these terms, but let's go back and see what we can make of this. Only if one follows patiently Socrates' discovery about desire can one see it. Can one see it turn upside down and discover that it is the presentation of desire by the thumo-eidetic that is put on the mask of reason. So when you're first reading it, you might think it's one kind of presentation of desire, but then you flip the picture over and suddenly the horse is in the dirt. It is then but a small step to apply this conversion to the Thrasymachus of the first book and realize that in the soul structure of book 4, there culminates one part of the Thrasymachian principle of the Republic, and such a culmination prepares the way for its elimination and the emergence of philosophy. So Thrasymachus is a character from book 1 of the Republic. He's the one who, in a nutshell, represents the view that, well, I'm not going to give it to you in a nutshell because I don't want to distort it, but he's a character who comes out fiercely against Socrates in book 1, argues that Socrates is naive, and that justice is the name that the rulers give to the obedience of the law that they set down for their own benefit. When you are just, when you follow the law, you are benefiting the rulers. They call just your obedience to them. Roughly. So he's got some argument here about Thrasymachus principle of the Republic. All this was known to Al-Farabi, who remarked that Plato combined the way of Socrates with the way of Thrasymachus, but it was Strauss who gave the full argument and indicated how one has to proceed beyond what Al-Farabi had written. I feel like I should say one more thing about this. You read the Republic and you have this character Thrasymachus. At first glance, you might think Thrasymachus just represents, again, to distort slightly here, you might think he just represents like the Nietzschean figure in the Republic, and that gradually he's just overcome or refuted. Al-Farabi and Strauss both gave a place of prominence to Thrasymachus as a key for interpreting the Republic in a way that's not obvious at first glance. What is most remarkable in the history of philosophy is the simultaneous dominance and absence of Plato. It is as impossible to conceive of Aristotle without Plato as to recall Aristotle. Excuse me, let me read that again. It is as impossible to conceive of Aristotle without Plato as to recall Plato while reading Aristotle. The Platonic forms show up in the manifold of treatises Aristotle wrote, and Plato disappears from the apparent separateness of those treatises, only to show up once more in the incoherence of the principles that do not allow Aristotle's treatises on the soul, on nature, and on being to be put together, even though they severally demand to be put together. Aristotle makes a kind of use of Plato that is partial, and the problems that that gives rise to could only be solved by the part that is left out. It is this kind of separation and combination that we're left to accomplish on our own when we come to Aristotle, and that Plato's Socrates practices continuously. Strauss realized that this is what it meant for Socrates to replace efficient material and final causation with his hypothesis of ideas. Efficient cause, what is the source of what happened? Material cause, what is the thing made of? Final cause, for which purpose or to what end? And Socrates felt that those kinds of explanations were inadequate, so he replaced them with his hypothesis of ideas, which Aristotle pretends to be a fourth modality of causation that can readily be added to the other three, rather than an abandonment of causality as it was known before Socrates. So what Benardete is talking about here is that Aristotle has misunderstood Plato. He's taken Plato's replacement of explanations by modes of causation via the ideas and collapse them so that the ideas are one among a number of modes of causation. This second sailing of the ideas, so if we just focused on the phrase as we have it here, then second sailing would mean abandoning the search for causes. This second sailing of the idea was inseparable from the promotion by Socrates of the soul as a non-derivative principle. Ontology, epistemology, and psychology were thereby joined and hence transformed, and it was one of Strauss's most beautiful discoveries to put together logos, being, and soul. We're just going to keep going until my battery dies or until we get through the essay. Strauss wrote up his interpretations of Plato's Euthyphro. These are some of Plato's dialogues. Strauss wrote up his interpretations of Plato's Euthyphro, Apology of Socrates, Crito, Euthydemus, Republic, Statesman, Minos, and Laws. It is not unreasonable to ask whether analyses so heavily weighted in favor of the political can do justice to Plato and do not distort Plato as much as the contemporary tilt in favor of the Phaedo, Theaetetus, Sophist, Parmenides, and Timaeus. It turns out, however, that what seems to be the unavoidable bias of the professional put Strauss in a unique position to return to Plato and his entire range through political philosophy. Strauss was in a department of political science. So you might think that as somebody working in the discipline of political science, he has to focus on Plato's political texts, Republic, Statesman, Laws, etc. Whereas there are other Platonic texts that have apparently less of a political emphasis. And so that's what Benardete is addressing here. It turns out, however, that what seems to be the unavoidable bias of the professional, namely that Strauss was a political scientist, put Strauss in a unique position to return to Plato in his entire range through political philosophy. Emphasizing on the political text becomes the key to accessing Plato's teaching proper. You see? The subtitle of Strauss's course on Plato's political philosophy was Its Metaphysical Foundations. I didn't know that. In his time, political philosophy had decayed so completely as to cease to be a part of philosophy. In Strauss's time, political philosophy had decayed so completely as to cease to be a part of philosophy. It had decayed so completely because philosophy itself had decayed so completely. The connection between political philosophy and ontology was not obvious, and the reason was the vanishing of the primary phenomena of the cave and their replacement by what Strauss called the cave beneath the cave. Strauss had to recover the cave in all its shadowiness before he could show the way out of the cave. This entailed the establishment of the fundamental character of the political in its double aspect, the nature of political things and the best form of the city. This double aspect can be said to show the simultaneous empiricism and idealism of Plato. Machiavelli understood the idealism by itself and accordingly failed to understand either its political ground or its philosophic purpose. The starting point for Strauss was simply the two questions Glaucon posed at the beginning of the second book of the Republic. But this starting point does not hold just for philosophy. This starting point does not hold just for political philosophy, but for philosophy as such. The nature of the beings, on the one hand, and on the other, the nature of the good. Forms of these two questions inform all of Plato's writings and all of human life. Of the two questions, the good is always first for us. We are willy-nilly oriented by the good. Philosophy after Plato had tended to forget this, partly because Plato had been so persuasive about the human good, and partly because the separation of philosophical disciplines could not keep the good as an essential part of each of them. The dialectical success of Plato in the articulation of things could not preserve the comprehensive reflection of Plato, which alone had made his success possible. The tradition of philosophy, remember we had discussed to a certain extent earlier, why did philosophy need to be rediscovered? Why did it need to be recovered? How did it become lost at all? And we said at first it had something to do with the success of making it safe for the city, where the opinions that were concealed just became forgotten. The tension that was essential to it became regarded as nothing. And that harmony was made, apparently, between philosophy and revelation. That was all earlier in this paper. So we see here something else, that The concern for these two fundamental questions, the nature of the beings and the nature of the good, which is a step into philosophy as a starting point, and it must pass through the realm of the political, all of that was forgotten. The tradition of philosophy thus became unphilosophic. And philosophy could not be restored unless one could go back to Plato, where the part that is being and the whole that is the good are constantly shown in their mutual interference. Political philosophy is the key to philosophy. Political philosophy is at the heart of philosophy. Political philosophy is first philosophy, not metaphysics, not ontology. Political philosophy is the holy of holies. Strauss, therefore, was always turning away from Plato to return to Plato, and turning back to Plato after the obstacles to such a return had been faced. It's not just, as he put it somewhere, quaint antiquarianism that drives us back to the study of Plato. It's concerns with, how did he put it here? Something that is fundamental for all of human life. Thinking about what are the beings, what is the good. And we're not historians of political thought here in any way. We're involved existentially through and through with these questions. In the history of scholarship, it is not easy to find anyone with as wide a range and depth of understanding throughout that range as Strauss. I told you the admiration and love that his students have for him and that you can develop for him if you begin to study his works. Let me go back here. In the history of scholarship, it is not easy to find anyone with as wide a range and depth of understanding throughout that range as Strauss. And such a successful union of disparate features speaks in a peculiar way for the soundness of his view that political philosophy is the eccentric core of philosophy. That's an amazing point, in fact. Here's what Benardete is saying. Strauss argues, on the basis of his understanding of Plato, that political philosophy is the heart of philosophy. And Strauss focuses on political philosophy as the heart of philosophy. In doing so, he produces such, I want to get that phrase again, such a range and depth of understanding that he makes it plausible that political philosophy is the core of philosophy. He brings so much to light so clearly, and he gives us access to such important phenomena so profoundly on the basis of the view that political philosophy is at the heart of philosophy that he makes it plausible. He makes the case that that's the sound view or the right view. Strauss often spoke of his subjective certainty. What he meant was the experimental nature of his way of interpretation. Once he could hypothesize about the drift of entire dialogue or a sufficiently complex argument, he would deduce from it the consequences that should hold in the text if the hypothesis were sound. So this isn't some sort of general theory building. This is his experimental nature in the way of interpretation. He hypothesizes about the drift of an entire dialogue only once he's getting it from the text itself. The consequences could range from a word to an entire argument that should be present or absent from the dialogue. Strauss was thus able to deduce that soul does not appear in the Euthyphro. Imagine you are well known for teaching something about the eternity of the soul, and you have a dialogue about religion, about piety, about God, in which the term soul does not appear. That would be a conspicuous absence. That's the kind of thing that Benardete is talking about here. Strauss was able to deduce that soul does not appear in the Euthyphro. What made this deduction subjective was not its willfulness, but that it could never carry the same conviction to anyone else who had not proceeded in the same way as Strauss had done. So imagine Strauss goes out on Twitter and he posts that he's deduced that soul does not appear in the Euthyphro, and a bunch of people who haven't done the work that he's done begin to ask him, what's your proof? What's your evidence? There's no objective proof. You have to go through the task of reading with the same conviction, the task of proceeding in the same way as Strauss had done to reach that insight. So it's not like it's not just a method that you can apply without doing the work. Indeed, some of these deductions would appear in print as spurious, as if what Strauss had really done was merely to construct a hypothesis that fit his observation. This appearance of specious serendipity is a necessity. Let me just restate this as much as I can. So, let's do it differently, actually. Let's just have Benardete speak for himself. So I'm going to reread that paragraph and go on. Strauss often spoke of his subjective certainty. What he meant was the experimental nature of his way of interpretation. Once he could hypothesize about the drift of an entire dialogue or a sufficiently complex argument, he would deduce from it the consequences that should hold in the text if the hypothesis were sound. The consequences could range from a word to an entire argument that should be present or absent from the dialogue. Strauss was thus able to deduce that soul does not appear in the Euthyphro. What made this deduction subjective was not its willfulness, but that it could never carry the same conviction to anyone else who had not proceeded in the same way as Strauss had done. Indeed, some of these deductions would appear in print as spurious, as if what Strauss had really done was merely to construct a hypothesis to fit his observation. This appearance of specious serendipity is a necessity. Once, when Strauss was discussing the Republic, he listed 7 examples that Socrates had given in the course of an argument, and remarked that from his experience he had learned that the center in an odd number of items turned out to be the most important, either in the immediate sequel or in the larger scheme of things. We were bemused and impressed when in this particular case the argument unfolded in the way that Strauss had anticipated. So if you see a list of 5 items, the third one is the most important. If you see a list of 7 items, the fourth one is most important. In an odd-numbered list, Strauss seems to have discovered in many cases that were helpful as an interpretive tool. The central item of the list is most important. A friend of mine who was more skeptical than the rest of us went home and took down from the shelf Montaigne's essays, counted their number, and looked up the central one. It was entitled On Vain Subtleties, and its theme was the importance of being in the middle. Perhaps the principle Strauss invoked most consistently in his interpretation of Plato was that of abstraction. On the basis of his long experience with the dialogues, he thought that the key to each was something absent from the dialogue, which was necessary for understanding the issue at hand. This principle is the hermeneutic. I'll give you an example. In the Republic, you often hear from these commentators that the Republic abstracts from the body in making its case. That's just one way to think about what it means to abstract from something, or a dialogue that abstracts from our erotic longing for completion, this is the idea that something important is abstracted from the dialogue, left out, made deliberately absent in order for the dialogue to appear. What did I just do here? Yeah. This principle is the hermeneutic equivalent to the difference between a being as a part of the whole and a being apart from its being a part of the whole. Aristotle, for example, discusses being in the metaphysics in such a way that it would make no difference whether there was only one being in the universe, but he pays heavily for this assumption, since he must end up with only one kind of being, which strictly is, and from which the universe necessarily falls away. In Plato, however, the abstraction from something essential to the issue turns out to be the revelation of the issue, and its apparent absence, a sign of the failure on our part to effect the periagogia, the turnaround of the argument. So here something is being left out of the picture, and in order to understand why it had to have been left out, once that clicks, then we have the proper understanding. The absence is essential, is what Benardete is saying. The most obvious question to raise about Strauss's principle is this: what is the principle that governs what Plato chooses to omit? After all, it would seem that any essential omission guarantees that nothing will be understood. If you omitted something essential, how can you understand things correctly? There must be then reasonable grounds for the omission, and these grounds must lie in the nature of the thing as it initially comes to light. The abstraction must be grounded in an abstraction by opinion, which has failed to take something decisive into account. So it can't just be that you arbitrarily abstract something essential. It has to be, in the ordinary course of affairs, somehow already pre-abstracted from the issue for common opinion. Let's see what Benardete says about it. Plato's procedure is based on the idealism of opinion, or the vulgar Platonism of opinion, which is checked in turn by the Platonic dialogue of participation. It thus turns out that abstraction in Platonic dialogues brings together 2 principles. Nothing can be understood if everything must be understood. So to understand something, you also have to have something left out or unsaid. And nothing can be properly understood if one does not take one's bearings by the necessarily improper starting point of understanding. I just want to say this to you briefly, that in Strauss's interpretation of Plato and Strauss's school's interpretation of Plato, you begin from opinion. You begin from what's said. You begin from the partial, messy, quote-unquote, improper starting point of understanding. And by going through the opinions, by rising from the opinions, you get to a clearer perspective. You don't bypass or denigrate or destroy or eradicate opinion as, for example, prejudice. You go through the opinion, on the back of opinion. And if that's the case, And if opinion in its own nature has this characteristic of over exaggerating, idealizing, or abstracting, then there's a hint there for us. Strauss's most startling illustration of his principle is in his discussion of the Republic. What the Republic abstracts from, he says, is the body, the most obvious sign of which is that the city, which is formed to supply bodily needs and does so perfectly, has a class structure based on the soul by itself. And this despite the fact that Socrates introduced the city as the analog of the individual and not his body or soul. The soul, the class structure of the soul gives us, sorry, can you see my cursor? The class structure of the soul gives us the foundation of the city. And why only the soul? Why not the body? The body is abstracted from. The city, then, is the locus of idealism. It is shot through and necessarily shot through with self-understanding. It is geared for the body, for the satisfaction of bodily needs, and lays claim to the soul. In its usurpation, the city is essentially the locus of alienation. It follows, therefore, that the city cannot make for happiness, and only if justice is radically reinterpreted as philosophy is Thrasymachus refuted on this issue. There's more there than I can paraphrase for you clearly, but let's say this. Can anybody find their happiness? Can we find our happiness in the political community? Or is political life fundamentally, quote, the locus of alienation, quote, shot through with self-misunderstanding? Well, the fact that we have to abstract from the body in order to make the case for justice may be the key that we need to answer that question. The last allusion to justice as philosophy, which occurs quite late in the Republic, calls attention to the most obvious character of Platonic arguments. They keep on moving and changing in the course of a single dialogue, so that one can legitimately ask whether it is ever possible to single out anything as conclusive, or whether we must simply go with the flow and not bother to pull together beginning, middle, and end. You go through a dialogue and it's presenting you, it's moving, it's changing in the course of a dialogue, the arguments, what justice is, what it requires, what's possible, what's desirable, what's good, noble, advantageous. And so we have a question. Does a dialogue make a whole, or is it rather an ever-moving series of insights and arguments that are not meant to come to an end? Or what exactly is gained in understanding a Platonic dialogue if the temporal flux of argument is integrated into the parts of a single whole? What Strauss came to see was that only if one were able to link up the temporal order, that means the movement and changing in the argument over time, with the part-whole order, that means the relationship between the parts to the whole, would the true argument ever emerge. The dissonance of pattern and sequence is of a different order than their coincidence. The dissonance of pattern and sequence is of a different order than their coincidence. It was through the transformation that a temporal segment underwent, when it became part of the whole, that Plato imitated the relation that always obtains between a part apart from the whole and a part as part of the whole. This imitation, which never ceases to amaze, made it possible for Plato to preserve the Socrates, who in never writing, Socrates never wrote, represents the truth that philosophy alone has no tradition, within the perpetuation of philosophy and its necessary decline. That's dense, isn't it? Let's look again. It was through the transformation that a temporal segment underwent when it became part of the whole, that Plato imitated the relation that always obtains between a part apart from the whole and a part as part of the whole. This imitation, which never ceases to amaze, made it possible for Plato to preserve the Socrates, who in never writing represents the truth that philosophy alone has no tradition, within the perpetuation of philosophy in its necessary decline. Strauss's deconstruction of philosophy is thus not Heidegger's, who hurried past Plato to Parmenides and Heraclitus by bypassing Socrates. That means we're set up here with two giant scholars, Strauss and Heidegger, contrasted over their return to Plato, particularly whether or not they see Socrates as a stumbling block. Or in other words, whether they bypass Plato hurriedly, like Benardete saying Heidegger did, or whether they see the truth of the nature of philosophy precisely in Socrates and in Plato's preservation of Socrates. Okay, let's go on. Strauss's second most important principle for the interpretation of Plato was the more obvious one. The dialogues were imitations because nothing in them was left to chance, but everything was in order, even though the circumstances of reason should not, it seems, partake of the same order as reason itself. So the dialogues, the first principle was the principle of abstraction, which we just discussed. But this principle is that there's nothing accidental in a Platonic dialogue. Everything is deliberate, everything is by design, everything is in its right place, logographic necessity. The elevation of the circumstantial into the inevitable pointed in two ways. First, it reflected the fact that for us, the starting point is always our interest, and this good, however conceived, is the engine of all serious discourse. What is true for life is as true for philosophy, which alone among the scientific disciplines has no principles from which to start except from life itself. To begin to philosophize, then, is to encounter a question that has been incorrectly formulated. The question reflects the true question, but it is not the true question. A Socratic discussion always moves toward a disclosure of the true question and its answer that determines at the same time the degree of displacement that was in the original question, and without which one could never have started. Plato's imitation of the relation between the beings and the good, as it first comes to light, confronts us with certain difficulties. Once we've come to know the character of the perspectival, are we allowed to discard it and come face to face with the beings in themselves? Strauss's short answer is only if the soul can be discounted at the same time and shown to be a derivative phenomenon. Granted that the occasion Plato fixed upon does not and cannot stand in for all other possible occasions in which an issue arises compatible to the one he chose, elliptical, but I kind of want to leave it to you to fill in the blanks. It still must be the case that the occasion for all its apparent particularity is susceptible to thematization, i.e. to a structural extension that is as general as any argument. Okay, Plato picked up on something temporal, gave us the structural expression, and this is a fair thing to do. This is where an interpreter can most easily go astray and where Strauss was most sure-footed. His reflection on the setting of the laws, in which the Athenian stranger is and is not Socrates, leads him to show the structural resemblance between wine drinking and a discussion of wine drinking on the one hand, and on the other, the descent of the stranger and the ascent of Megillus the Spartan and Clinias the Cretan. What Benardete is talking about here is the essay called What is Political Philosophy? In the book called What is Political Philosophy. I teach it in my introduction to Strauss at millermanschool.com, but you should just find it and read it. There's a version of it online that's 20-something pages, but the version in the book is 50-something pages. Read the version from the book, What is Political Philosophy? Such a reflection led him in turn to the Phaedrus, through which Strauss could understand why Cicero began his laws with borrowings in equal measure from Plato's Phaedrus and Plato's laws. Let's see here. Okay, we're getting through. We're making way. Again, I can't possibly imagine anyone's watching this, but if you are, I hope you're learning something together with me. Strauss's way of interpreting Plato so that he became the model of all genuine philosophy raises the question of poetry and its ancient quarrel with philosophy. Just as it is easy to recognize the difference between post-Platonic and pre-Platonic philosophy, despite the poorness of our sources for both, so it is no less facile to distinguish between poetry and philosophy, as long as one does not look to Plato and wonder whether he is a hybrid who, in putting paid to the issue of poetry for all subsequent philosophy until Nietzsche and Heidegger, did not resolve the tension between the poet and the philosopher in himself. Philosophy and poetry, like philosophy and revelation, there's an alternative there that we don't want to collapse before we have thought through. Strauss was alone, I suspect, in showing the spuriousness of this apparently self-evident divide in Plato. One way of stating the issue is to raise the question of translation, for if one renders Plato idiomatically so that one conveys what one believes is the sense and not the words, one has already decided that the poet Plato, who is a legitimate subject of this kind of rendering, is irreconcilable with the philosopher, whose arguments everyone would agree should be presented as exactly as possible. In a recent translation of the Symposium, the translator puts into a heroic couplet 2 lines of epic verse that Agathon made up in honor of Eros. Eros brings, Agathon says, sweet peace to men and calm o'er all the deep, rest to the winds, to those who sorrow sleep. The translation seems flawless until one notices that rest is not the same as koite, which means either sleep or bedtime. The sleep of the winds, instead of rest to the winds, the sleep of the winds points directly to Agathon's argument that Eros is the god of poetic production, by whose agency the metaphorical becomes literal. It seems, therefore, almost inevitable that that translator introduces the couplet with the words Eros brings and not with Eros makes. Perhaps one could come to understand Agathon even through a non-literal translation, but Strauss alone, as far as I know, did understand him because he followed the argument down to and from the details. So what this section is saying, if you didn't really follow it, is that Strauss, in his hyper-attentiveness to the details, was able to see things that those people miss who think they can freely reinterpret Plato if they treat him, quote-unquote, poetically, and therefore take some sort of, quote-unquote, poetic license with his words. Perhaps the most puzzling as well as the most unexpected aspect in Strauss's recovery of Plato and philosophy concerns the status of the Greek poets before Plato. Even if Plato does not open up the only way to them, it is certainly the most accessible. Without Plato, the tragedies of Sophocles, to say nothing of Aristophanes, whom we mentioned earlier, are almost lost to us. Their understanding of the city, particularly of its sub-political foundations and of the law, particularly the sacred law, would remain in darkness were it not for the light Plato brings to them. The logos of Plato unveils the mythos of poetry for the logos that it is. In other words, once we understand Platonic political philosophy, once we understand Plato, we have a key to understanding the pre-Platonic poets in their poetry as making an argument about the sacred law and the city. Once, however, this is acknowledged, the Socratic revolution in philosophy seems to be coeval with Greek poetry, which had realized from the start, with its principle of telling lies, like the truth, the relation of argument and action. So if it's the case that we have access to the philosophy of the pre-Platonic Greek poets through Plato, then we bring them to light as already understanding the relationship of argument and action and already somehow philosophical. Homer and Hesiod then would have to be recognized as already within the orbit of philosophy. It is a remarkable fact whose significance Strauss was the first or last to see that the only mention of nature in Homer has this meaning in Plato, but not the philosophers who preceded him. Strauss's recovery of Plato opened up the possibility of gathering into the fold of philosophy more than philosophy had ever dreamed of. If you really understand that, it's one of the reasons why I consider it imperative for us, with Strauss's guidance, to study Plato. Strauss's recovery of Plato, to repeat, opened up the possibility of gathering into the fold of philosophy more than philosophy had ever dreamed of. I cannot end this discussion of Strauss on Plato, Benardete continues, without quoting Strauss's account of Plato's understanding of the philosopher, for it applies no less to Strauss in himself than to Strauss in his understanding of Plato. Here we go, Strauss on Plato. Then Benardete quoting Strauss on Plato. To articulate the problem of... Let me just introduce it again. I'm sorry, I had to pause the video to take a phone call. And I want to get back on track. I cannot end this discussion of Strauss on Plato without quoting Strauss's account of Plato's understanding of the philosopher, for it applies no less to Strauss in himself than to Strauss in his understanding of Plato. To articulate the problem of cosmology means to answer the question of what philosophy is or what a philosopher is. Plato refrained from entrusting the thematic discussion of this question to Socrates. He entrusted it to a stranger from Elia. But even that stranger did not discuss explicitly what a philosopher is. He discussed explicitly 2 kinds of men which are easily mistaken for the philosopher: the sophist and the statesman. By understanding both sophistry in its highest as well as its lowest meaning, and statesmanship, one will understand what philosophy is. Philosophy strives for knowledge of the whole. The whole is the totality of parts. The whole eludes us, but we know the parts. We possess partial knowledge of parts. The knowledge which we possess is characterized by a fundamental dualism which has never been overcome. At one pole, we find knowledge of homogeneity, above all in arithmetic, but also in the other branches of mathematics, and derivatively in all productive arts or crafts. At the opposite pole, we find knowledge of heterogeneity, and in particular of heterogeneous ends. The highest form of this kind of knowledge is the art of the statesman and of the educator. The latter kind of knowledge is superior to the former for this reason. The knowledge of heterogeneity is superior to the knowledge of homogeneity for this reason. As knowledge of the ends of human life, it is knowledge of what makes human life complete or whole. It is therefore knowledge of a whole. Knowledge of the ends of man implies knowledge of the human soul. And the human soul is the only part of the whole which is open to the whole, and therefore more akin to the whole than anything else is. But this knowledge, the political art in the highest sense, is not knowledge of the whole. So knowledge of the human soul is not knowledge of the whole. It seems that knowledge of the whole would have to combine somehow political knowledge in the highest sense with knowledge of homogeneity. And this combination is not at our disposal. Men are therefore constantly tempted to force the issue by imposing unity on the phenomena, by absolutizing either knowledge of homogeneity or knowledge of ends. Men are constantly attracted and deluded by two opposite charms: the charm of competence, which is engendered by mathematics and everything akin to mathematics, and the charm of humble awe, which is engendered by meditation on the human soul and its experiences. Philosophy is characterized by the gentle, if firm, refusal to succumb to either charm. It is the highest form of the mating of courage and moderation. In spite of its highness or nobility, it could appear as Sisyphean or ugly when one contrasts its achievement with its goal. Yet it is necessarily accompanied, sustained, and elevated by eros. It is graced by nature's grace. Thank you very much for watching. This has been an overview of Seth Benardete's essay Strauss on Plato. You can visit millermanschool.com for courses on Strauss and Plato. I hope you've enjoyed this. That last passage is worth reading again and again. See you in the next video.